let's take a look at the knight that best exemplifies the glory of the charge, the Cerastus Knight Lancer. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about looking at the best ways to use our fancy models on the tabletop. We're continuing with our series on Forge World Knights today. We've been looking at a different Forge World Knight each week and how we might add it to the army, and it's time to look at the dedicated melee monster that is the Cerastus Knight Lancer. In this video we'll take a look at its rules, any obvious buffs or combos that we can use to make it stronger on the battlefield, and some tactics for using it in-game. Now the Knight Lancer is one of the most widely esteemed knight classes available to a household. They're mounted on the very agile Cerastus patterned chassis, which is quicker and more nimble than the more typical Questoris class. These guys are seen as particularly noble because nothing exemplifies a knight's honour like meeting a foe in honourable single combat, where only a well-timed thrust of a lance can be the difference between victory and oblivion. I also really quite like the model. It's very dynamic, and I think it's very cool they've taken a lance and shield and made them up to knight-sized armaments. So how does this work on the battlefield? Let's take a look at the rules. So, as per the new Forge World FAQ, the Knight Lancer will set you back 420 points and will provide you with the stat line that we see here. It's got a mighty move of 14 inches when it's undamaged, which is faster than the Questoris class, weapon skill and ballistic skill 3 up, strength and toughness of 8, 27 wounds, so a decent durability upgrade, 4 attacks, leadership 9 and a 3 up save. I think it's going to be most helpful to compare it to a Gallant, which is also a dedicated melee monster. So this thing is 70 points more expensive, and on the profile that gives you an extra 3 wounds, an extra 2 inches of movement, but unfortunately you lose the weapon skill of 2 up, and you only have 4 attacks. So a bit faster and a bit more durable, but not quite as killy in close combat, based on raw stats alone. This only has the one offensive weapon, which is the Cerastus Shock Lance. Now it does have a shooting profile. It's a 18-inch range, heavy 6 weapon with strength 6, AP -1 and damage D3. The 18-inch range is fairly limiting, meaning that you're only going to have so many targets that you're going to be able to choose to fire at. As it is though, it's a fairly multi-purpose weapon. Being both multi-damage and mid-strength will mean that it'll put a few wounds either on a horde or on a heavy target, and is probably best used when fighting toughness 5 or 6 multi-wound models. It's never going to be anything on the same level as your other main knight armaments though, so I wouldn't go looking for it to make a big difference to your battle plan. I'd treat this as a slightly more powerful heavy stubber, not something that you're ever going to move your knight in a different direction to use. You really need to be focusing on getting this guy into melee. Speaking of melee, the Cerastus Shock Lance has an incredibly nice melee profile. It is strength +6, AP -4 and flat damage 6. But when the Cerastus Knight charges, its strength characteristic becomes ×2 and the damage characteristic becomes 8. Now that's quite interesting because it's actually equal to the stats of the Paragon Gauntlet, so you can essentially have a knight that's bearing a Paragon Gauntlet, but obviously it doesn't have to pay for that relic, and has the option to take a different relic if it desires. Now to be fair, it's only on the charge that it gets to be quite that strong, but this thing will be wanting to do a lot of charging, so it is going to apply in a lot of the combats that it enters into. Also bear in mind that it's not quite as good as the Gallant with a Paragon Gauntlet, because Gallants have 5 attacks hitting on 2s, whereas this only has 4 attacks hitting on 3s. If you're not wanting to use this, say if you're fighting a horde, then you'll be using your Titanic Feat, which will essentially have you hitting the same as a standard Questoris pattern knight, such as a Errant or a Paladin. Now it has the normal Imperial Knight special rules of Super Heavy Walker and Explodes, which we've covered multiple times already, so we're not going to go into detail on them here, though exploding could be pretty powerful, because this thing's going to be getting right in the grill of the enemy. So if it detonates on death, it's likely to shower a lot of fancy enemy units with a bunch of mortal wounds. The Knight Lancer's unique rule though is Iron Gauntlet Shield, so this model has a 5+ invul save, and it increases to a 4 up invul save against attacks made by melee weapons, and in addition you subtract 1 from hit rolls for attacks made with melee weapons by Titanic units that target this model. So basically having a 4 up invul in melee, that's pretty strong. Melee is one of the most efficient ways to kill Imperial Knights if you get, say, a fighty character with a Thunderhammer into them. it's going to be good to ignore half the damage that they inflict. The -1 to hit against Titanic units has the potential to be relatively powerful, but obviously it's only really going to apply if you're fighting enemy knights, and even then they'll still be able to get a bunch of damage through. If you do happen to be fighting a gallant, for example, they will still be hitting on 3s, so it's a nice little flavourful touch. Might come up and might be powerful on occasion, but I wouldn't worry too much about this. The 4-up invul against everything, when in melee, is by far the stronger part of the deal. So all in all, the Knight Lancer is a melee beast. It's faster and tougher than the gallant, and particularly tougher when it's in close combat, though it has weaker melee against hordes and infantry, but very very good melee when against heavy vehicles with that flat damage 8 on the turn it charged. So let's have a quick think about all the different ways that we can get the most out of this unit, and the different buffs that we can apply to it. So most of the Knight households are actually pretty decent with this guy. Firstly, House Terran's pretty powerful, as it will give you extra chance of making the charge, which is very important, but perhaps more importantly, it'll let you access that 3 command point stratagem to have your knight fight again. When you're rolling with a bunch of strength 8 attacks in close combat, getting double the amount of attacks could be very powerful indeed, particularly if you combine this with the Knight Seneschal Warlord trait to get an extra attack in the first place. House Griffith is also powerful with that extra attack, which will put the Knight Lancer to a base of 5 in the first round of close combat. House Hawkshroud will help it degrade slower, which is generically useful, but only really comes into any use when it is actually damaged. Cadmus can let you access reroll 1s to wound, and Mortan will give you +1 to hit in the first round of close combat too. Out of the various melee buffs, Mortan and Griffiths both give the Knight Lancer a 25% damage buff in close combat, but House Cadmus only gives it a 16% buff. So if you're going to purely buff its melee potential, I'd go for Griffiths or Morton, if you're going Questor Imperialis. If you're going for Mechanicus, however, then Crast is a solid pick. 4 rerolls to hit in the fight phase in the first turn of combat is actually a 33% buff to its damage output, so it's actually stronger than either Griffiths or Mortan when on its own. Tyrannus is always strong and one of my favourite Knight households. Getting 6 up Feel No Pain will keep your knights alive and kicking for longer, and potentially getting back up after they die could really throw a spanner in your opponent's works. Unfortunately, Volker and Raven aren't quite as strong with these guys, as they work a lot better with shooting focused households. So overall, probably my favourite household for this guy is Crast, with other good picks being Tyrannus, Griffiths, Mortan or Terran. Let's talk about Warlord traits and relics now. Now, much like the Gallant, Landstrider is absolutely amazing on a Knight Lancer. It has an even higher potential threat range than the Gallant, due to its base move of 14 inches, and it's a solid advantage over the Gallant in that respect. If you use the Lancer with Landstrider and the Full Tilt stratagem, you'll have an average expected threat range of 28 inches, so your opponent is going to have to deploy way back if they don't want to be charged by this guy, and a maximum threat range of 36 inches if your stars align. Knight Seneschal could be another decent pick for the Lancer, as +1 attacks with a very powerful weapon such as it has is certainly a solid option, and as always Iron Bulwark is a great option if you've just got an Imperial Knight that you really want to make sure the opponent has to work hard to kill. In terms of relics, the Lancer only has so many options, as a lot of them are restricted to certain pieces of war gear. Probably my favourite pick would be the Armour of Sainted Ion, which would be particularly powerful if you're expecting this guy to be hit by a whole bunch of low AP shooting. If you really are tuning this guy up to absolutely obliterate enemy knights, you could think about using the Headsman's Mark if you're running him as Crast. It's not honestly the most powerful thing on him compared with some of the other options, but just the thought of having a damage 10 weapon on the charge is pretty hilarious. Let's take a quick look at stratagems now, and this guy will certainly profit from a lot of the ones that were commonly used on the Gallant. Unfortunately, I've just realised that Noble Sacrifice is only available to Questoris and Dominus and Armiger pattern knights, so unfortunately the Knight Lancer can't make use of that. That's a bit of a blow really, as I really quite like Exploding Knight. It's just so great to punish your opponent for killing a big model with a whole shower of mortal wounds. Thunderstomp is an option to try and put some mortal wounds on something that's almost dead. Rotate Ion Shields is always good for defending your Imperial Knights. Full Tilt we've already mentioned, and this guy is one of the best users of this stratagem, having no real shooting that it cares about that much. Valiant Last Stand is a powerful choice for a Questor Imperialis knight. By allowing this guy to get a few more attacks when he dies, you could potentially either stack some more damage on a key target, or maybe drag down whatever killed your Lancer with it in close combat. Machine Spirit Resurgent is usually going to be worth it when applied to a Questor Mechanicus class knight, as fighting on your top profile is good. And for some of the household specific ones, we really quite like Glory and Honour, the Terran stratagems let them fight again, Controlled Aggression, the crass stratagem to get extra hits on 6s, and our Darkest Hour, the House Tyrannus stratagem to potentially get your knight back up on a 4+. So how would I field a Knight Lancer on the battlefield? If I was just fielding one of these guys, and I had the option to give him a Warlord trait and a relic, then I will give him Landstrider and the Armour of Sainted Ion. This will give you a very tough, very fast distraction Carnifex type knight that can charge into the midst of the enemy lines like a wrecking ball and potentially be very hard for the opponent to shift, particularly in close combat with that incredibly nice 4-up invul save. I don't think that I would really recommend running an entire lance of these guys. I feel like if you were running a lot of close combat knights, I might run him alongside a couple of other gallants and use this chap to particularly focus on any heavy hitters that the enemy has, while your gallants are a little bit better in close combat against hordes compared with this guy, as well as being a fair bit cheaper. The way that you'll want to use him on the battlefield is pretty similar to a gallant. If you have first turn, I'd strongly be considering him starting at the front of the deployment zone, and if there was any doubt at all about him making the charge, I would certainly think about advancing him and using full tilt. This guy has some half decent shooting, and it's certainly nice to use it when you can, but I honestly wouldn't let it distract you from the main priority, which is to get this guy into melee, dealing damage with that Cerastus shock lance. In particular, you're going to be wanting to tangle with enemy heavies. In particular, this guy will be perfect at fighting knights, so if your opponent does have Titanic units himself, then this is the guy that you want to be engaging them in close combat with. If your opponent has first turn, and he has melee units closing in on you, then I would still ideally try and screen this guy out so he can't be charged, so you get the charge in your own turn next time, maybe by using some allied guardsmen or admech to block movement paths. But compared with the Knight Gallant, he's going to be a lot safer in close combat, and a lot harder to shift. If there's any knight in your army that can take a charge better than most, then it's this guy. A 4-up invul in close combat is really quite a powerful thing. I certainly know it when I remember to take Sanctuary on my gallants, and rotate ion shields in the fight phase. That can definitely be the difference between living and dying when you're fighting something nasty in close combat, such as that Demon Prince build that Chaos Demons are very fond of with the Skull Reaver axe. Much like a gallant, I feel that this guy might not necessarily always make his points back over the course of a game, unless he's rolling particularly well and gets to fight multiple times in close combat. But one of the main advantages is that by throwing him up to the front of the enemy lines, you're forcing them to have to deal with him first, where they might often be wanting to shoot your other assets, like your Shooty Knights and Crusaders for example. Being pretty tough and very tough in close combat means that you might be causing a bit more of a headache for your opponent to deal with. So the main question as to whether or not we're going to use this guy in an army list for reasons other than cool looks and fun rules, which I admit that this thing has in abundance, is whether or not we're going to use him over a gallant. So let's compare the two now. This guy is 420 points versus the gallant's 352, at least pre-chapter approved. We might have to double check if this changes with chapter approved 2019 upon us. So he does cost at the moment almost 70 points more than the gallant, so you really do need to weigh up whether or not that 70 points is worth it, compared with putting it towards your next Knight Gallant if you're desperate for knights to fit the melee role. So for survivability for points, this guy costs 15.5 points per wound, whereas the Gallant is 14.6. So against shooting, he is slightly more squishy than a Gallant is, but being one single consolidated model means that he makes more efficient use of the Armour of Sainted Ion and rotate ion shields if you use it on him. Also, don't forget that this guy essentially gets a boosted Sanctuary relic for free in close combat, so is massively more survivable there. Overall, I'd say in terms of survivability, it's actually probably a win for this guy, because he's only slightly more weak to shooting, but he is absolutely massively more durable in close combat. In terms of damage output, this guy has the edge in terms of shooting pretty heftily compared with one heavy stubber, though of course the Gallant does have the option to take something like an Ironstorm missile pod, which if you're desperate for that little bit of extra shooting is a very very cheap buy for the points. So this guy slightly edges out in shooting, but it's really the melee profile that we care about more. Against hard targets such as enemy knights, on the charge this guy will get an average of 17 wounds, obviously in multiples of 8, so most likely either 16 or 24 wounds through, though it is quite swingy of course. The Knight Gallant, fighting with its Thunderstrike gauntlets, will get an average of 16.6 wounds through. But bear in mind that because the Gallant is so much cheaper than this Knight, the Gallant is more efficient against hard targets, which is what you'd expect the Cerastus Knights to win against. When it comes to using its stomp attacks, which it will be against a variety of targets, the Gallant massively wins on this because it has the 2-up weapon skill and 5 attacks. On average the Gallant will get 12.5 stomp hits, compared with the Cerastus' only 8. So that's a massive win for the Gallant there, with basically an extra 50% of the damage output, despite being 70 points cheaper. Overall, I'd draw the conclusion that in terms of pure power and competitive ability, I would recommend the Gallant over this for most army lists. But interestingly enough, this guy will almost certainly win fights if you're fighting enemy Gallants. So in a mirror match, this guy would probably win because of its extra roll for -1 to hit against Titanics and its very nice 4-up invul save. I think the two are fairly reasonably balanced. It'd only take a small points increase for the Gallant or a small points drop for this guy to make them pretty much even in my books. And who knows, maybe we will see that with chapter approved. In any case, I'd see absolutely nothing wrong with running this guy as part of a knight's army if you're not optimizing it to squeeze every last inch of power out of it. He's certainly a powerful model with powerful rules, and could cause your opponent a massive headache with that huge movement and very tough ability in close combat. So thanks for listening to another Auspex Tactics unit review. We'll most certainly be continuing our review of the Forge World Knights as we go on. Let me know if there's any particular Forge World Knight that you most likely me to cover next, and I'll be strongly tempted to review the knight with the most votes. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more like this, or to support me on Patreon if you're finding my videos useful. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.